Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and in today's video, I wanted to talk about some NBA players that aren't in the league anymore, but are still receiving a paycheck from an NBA team according to Basketball Reference. Now, the way that this works is sometimes players are either waived or bought out, and then they never sign a contract with another team, so obviously they end up out of the league, but they are still being paid by the team that waived them or bought them out, depending on how that works. Maybe it was a stretch provision, maybe it was how they negotiated the buyout, but a lot of these players, it's pretty surprising that they are still receiving a check from an NBA team, and we're going to look at some of those today. Keep in mind that this list is former NBA players only, so if you're expecting to see guys like potentially Joakim Noah on this list, maybe even Luol Deng, those guys are still in the league. The title says former NBA players. That's why they're not on here. If you want to see a list of those guys, I'd be happy to do it, but just a quick aside, because I feel like there's going to be a few people that are going to ask me where those guys are, and it's because, again, it's former players, not current players. Starting off, and you can see that we are on the Basketball Reference payroll page for all of these teams, so this is legit. This is according to Basketball Reference. And at the bottom of the screen, for the Portland Trailblazers of all teams, you can see Anderson Varejao's name being paid a little bit less than $2 million all the way through the 2021 season. Now, what happened was Varejao was traded to the Blazers in 2016 from the Cavaliers in exchange for a first-round pick. The Blazers took on Varejao's contract using their salary cap in exchange for the pick, and then they immediately waived him. And like I said before, a lot of these guys end up getting stretched. And as many of you know, Varejao was an extremely popular player with the Cleveland Cavaliers a couple of years ago, and was a really fun and exciting and energetic player with them. Some people have mixed opinions on him, but going back to the trade really quickly, the first round pick that the Cavs traded to the Blazers ended up becoming Mo Wagner, but the Trailblazers traded that pick before they used it, and used it to get a pick to select Caleb Swanigan. Moving on now that I've kind of explained how everything works, let's get to one that's a little bit more interesting, and that is Larry Sanders of the Milwaukee Bucks. As you can see, he's still only 30 years old, but he's being paid this year as well as the 3 following seasons, all the way to 2022. Larry Sanders is still being paid by the Milwaukee Bucks. He's a player that was extremely talented, was someone that earned himself a big payday from the Bucks, and just for whatever reason just could not stay in the league. He had some off-the-court issues and just was never really able to stay on the floor to get his life together enough to be an active participant in the NBA. And as a result, the Bucks ended up buying him out in 2015, and then they stretched his contract over 7 whole years. He was bought out, like I said, in 2015, and they will be paying him all the way until 2022. It's just crazy to see a player like that still on the payroll for the Bucks. You can see he's not the only guy. Like Spencer Hawes is still on there, Jody Meeks, Mirza Teletovic, but for me, the biggest name and the most interesting name is definitely Larry Sanders. Speaking of interesting names, we move on now to the Detroit Pistons, and one that people probably could have guessed when they saw the title of this video if they're familiar with recent, NBA transactions in general, and that is Josh Smith still being paid $5 million by the Detroit Pistons both this year as well as next year. Smith signed a big free agency deal with the Detroit Pistons a couple years ago. They ended up waiving him in 2014 and then stretching his contract while Van Gundy was still in charge of basketball operations for the team, and that was one of the big deals that he certainly whiffed on, and then the team is kind of paid for it ever since by still paying for this guy despite not having been on the roster, like I said, since 2014. Next up now, this one's a little bit different because it's not like a huge name player that was bought out because they're making a ton of money and then they stretched the money over a couple of seasons. This is just a player that is really old and hasn't been in the league for a little bit. It's just surprising that he is still being paid. And in this case, that is Kevin Martin of the Minnesota Timberwolves, still making a little bit over $1 million from the Timberwolves this season, despite not having been on the roster since 2016. That's when he was waived. And it's just weird to see a player like that, at that advanced of an age, someone that hasn't been in the league for a couple of years, someone that I'm sure a lot of people have just forgotten about, still being paid by an NBA team. Next up now, this one isn't all that surprising. It's the San Antonio Spurs and 2 players that have recently retired, and that is Manu Ginobili and Tim Duncan. Ginobili being paid $2.5 million this year, and Duncan being paid about 1.9 this year, and then both of them are done after this season. I don't 100% know how it works when players retire, if they negotiate a new salary to be paid, if they retired while they were still under contract with the team. I don't 100% know what happened with these 2 guys, and it could very well be something different than what's listed here, but both of these are obviously not in the league anymore. They've both retired, but they are still being paid by the Spurs in their early 40s. Number 8 now, and this is a player that there's actually a couple of players to talk about here, but the big one here, and this one hurts me to see, is Deron Williams still being paid by the Brooklyn Nets $5.5 million both this year and next year. There's some other notable names on that list: Dwight Howard, Kenneth Faried, Greg Monroe. The D. Will thing is tough because when he was first traded to the Nets, it was really exciting. He was playing really well and just went downhill so quickly, had some ankle issues, had some general injury issues, and just was never the same player after probably 2 seasons with the team, and ultimately ended up being bought out of what was at the time a max contract at the time that he signed it. And as a result, the Nets ended up having to stretch that buyout, stretch that amount that they were paying him. And like I said, he is still being paid $5.5 million both this year and next year, despite being waived and stretched all the way back in 2015. Then he signed with, I think, the Mavs, and the Cavs bounced around, and obviously he is not in the league anymore. But it's just crazy to see that we are still paying him. Unfortunately, by we, obviously, I mean the Nets. Next up now, another team that actually has a couple of interesting players on here is the Indiana Pacers. Guys like Al Jefferson are still on there, but the big one to me is Monta Ellis, simply because of how many years this is stretched over. Monta Ellis is making over $2 million from the Indiana Pacers all the way until 2022. He was stretched and waived in 2017 as a guy that probably could still be in the league right now, just hasn't found the right fit, hasn't found the right team to sign him. Really productive player, really great scorer. Just had some issues defensively. The Pacers did end up waiving him, despite him being, still pretty good for them while he was there. Signed a fairly big contract, and they just apparently wanted to get out from under his money. They waived him, they stretched it, and again, they're going to be paying him all the way until 2022. Next up is by far the largest salary amount in this video, but also the most unfortunate circumstance out of all these guys in terms of a player that is no longer in the league and is still being paid by an NBA team, and that's Chris Bosh being paid by the Miami Heat almost $27 million this year. After this year, they will be done having to pay him. But I'm sure if you're an NBA fan, you're familiar with this situation. He was playing really well for the Heat, still only 34. He could have had many more productive years in the NBA the last couple of seasons, as well as moving forward, but he just had an unfortunate medical situation with some blood clot issues in his lungs, I believe, and it's just a situation you don't want to mess around with. And as a result, there was too much liability involved for the Heat or any other team to sign him and pay him and play him on their NBA roster. So I don't entirely know the specifics of how everything got worked out between the Heat and Chris Bosh. I'm almost positive that his salary is not counting towards the cap. I think there was some kind of exemption used there to where they are still cutting him a check, but he is not part of their roster. He's not on the salary cap. But again, being paid almost $27 million by the Miami Heat, a good amount of time after he first experienced the health issues and then recently officially retired from the NBA despite not having played in the league for a little while. And last up now, this is a player that I didn't really know if I wanted to cover because I didn't know if everybody would know who he was, but the Oklahoma City Thunder, this is a fairly recent waive or buyout, are going to be paying Kyle Singler all the way until 2023. Now, they're only going to be paying him about $1 million a season for the next 5 seasons, including this one. But it's just it's just crazy to think that Kyle Singler, I don't know what he's doing with his basketball life right now. I don't know if he's playing overseas, if he's just chilling, just hanging out. But Kyle Singler is going to be getting $1 million check every year from the Oklahoma City Thunder for the next 5 seasons. And this is, I think he was making about $5 million a year, and then they waived him, and then obviously stretched that $5 million over 5 years. But, it's just crazy to see someone like Kyle Singler that is still going to be getting paid that far into the future. And that's really the point of this whole list is just how interesting it is and how crazy it is that some of these guys are former players and they're still going to be getting paid. Now, the circumstances of how they're getting paid could be different. Again, this is according to Basketball Reference. There could have been under-the-table deals worked out. There could have been other things negotiated that were never made public that made these figures a little bit different, but it's just crazy to see. And you can look at this for every team. All you have to do is look at their contract section of Basketball Reference if you're curious, and you can look and see in their dead cap section, essentially their dead payroll section, because the active players are up here and the non-active players that are not part of the roster are down there, guys that got waived or released and that they had to negotiate a buyout for potentially, are down here at the bottom, not affecting anything in terms of the actual roster, but still on the books, still guys that have to be paid even in some cases all the way to 2023. And yeah, that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.